Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Dalid, and Miras Hashem today we will be learning Daf Reish Pei Hey Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn the halachas of Rosh Chodesh. We pick up today on the top of Reish Pei Hey Amud Aleph with a new Siman, Siman Taf Chaf Gimel, Seder Krias HaTorah Rosh Chodesh. Largely, we're going to be discussing the setup of laning on Rosh Chodesh, Ubay Dal Seifim, and here we have 4 Seifim. So, of course, Siman Tav Chav Gimel is coming on the heels of Siman Tav Chav Beis. In Tav Chav Beis, we discussed the Krias HaHallel, saying Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, and after Hallel, we are up to laning. Today's shir is going to be audio only. Our learning today should be a schos for Achedu Beis Yisrael, Hanusunu Batzaru Bashivya, Ha'imde Bein Bayomu Bein Bayabasha, Hamakim Yerachim Aleha V'Yitziyah Mitzaru L'Rfacha, Me'afelu La'ara Mishubu L'Geula Hashta Bagala V'Zman Kariv V'Nemar Amen. Our learning should be a schos, Refuah Shalema, for Achi Hagadol B'Shaber Esther Fradel, for Esther Fradel Bas Chana, for Yeshua Levi Ben Ahuva Malka Chana, Rivka Bashir Leah, Chavadasa Bas Rezel Serel, Yitzhak Ben Tzion Ben Dusha, Tradi Bas Batsheva, and Yeruchim Ben Masha. They should all have a refuah shalema b'sarch shar chayla Yisrael. Says the Mechaber Siman Tav Chav Gimel Sif Aleph. Aimer Kaddish Tiskabel. After you complete Hallel, the Chazan is going to say a Kaddish Shalem. He's going to say Kaddish with Tiskabel. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Aleph Tiskabel Uklal Hu. Says the Chavetz Chaim. This is a rule. The Kol Yom Sheyesh by Musaf, any day that we're going to daven Musaf, so Rosh Chodesh, we daven Musaf, Chol Hamoed, we daven Musaf, Yom Tov, we daven Musaf, Oimrim Kaddish Tiskabel Achar Hallel. We have a Kaddish Shalem after Hallel, to whose Siyuma to Tefillah Shachris. Once we daven the Shachris Shmoneh Esrei, we said Hallel, we're done with Shachris. The next step is going to be Krias HaTorah and then a Musaf. So now we could already be Messiah. We could end off the whole Tefillah Shachris with a Kaddish Tiskabel, a Kaddish Shalem after Hallel. There's a very interesting Dirshu footnote over here. Dirshu footnote number 1. Right? Dirshu footnote, no, let me find it. Yeah, Dirshu footnote number 1. It says here in the footnote, V'hakadesh shala achar Hallel, this Kaddish Shalom that the Chazan is going to say after Hallel, Kasav le'el, we learned earlier in Siman Kuf Chav Gimel Sivkat Yud Ches, Shehu Misyaches L'Tfilas HaShmoneh Esrei. Really, this Kaddish Shalom that we're saying after Hallel, it's going back on Tfilas Shachris. The Ikar of Tfilas Shachris is the Tfilah of Shmoneh Esrei. So this Kaddish Shalom is kind of like the closure after the Shmoneh Esrei of Tfilah Shachris. Ulechein, and therefore, Kasav Sham, we learned over there, Sheyizar Hashatz Miladaber, Shalom Inyani Atfilah, Achar Ad La'achar Kaddish Tiskabel Shala Achar Hallel. Since the Chazan is saying the Kaddish Shalom after Hallel, really on the Tfilah Shmoneh Esrei of Shachris, it's incumbent upon the Chazan to make sure that he doesn't make any kind of unnecessary hefsik, any kind of interruption. He shouldn't speak anything that doesn't have to do with davening. If he has to turn to the Gabbai and he has to ask the Gabbai, I'm not sure, am I supposed to say Chatzi Kaddish or Kaddish Shalom? That's bein Yanei HaTfilah. But he should not speak out anything that's not Tzarchei Tfilah between the Chazaras HaShatz and the eventual Kaddish Shalom after Hallel, because that Kaddish Shalom is actually going back on the Shmoneh Esrei. Now, in the next paragraph here, he brings up something that does happen. I've seen this happen. Ve'im tov amar la'achar hallel chatzi kaddish. What happens if the Chazan, they finish Hallel, and now, instead of saying Kaddish Shalom, he says Chatzi Kaddish. There are times that we say Chatzi Kaddish after Hallel. For example, Chanukah. On Chanukah, there's no Musaf. So on Chanukah, we don't say a Kaddish Shalom with Tiskabel after Hallel. We only say a Chatzi Kaddish. So there is a precedent for a Chatzi Kaddish after Hallel. So maybe the Chazan is going to get confused, and he's going to finish Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, and he only says a Chatzi Kaddish. He doesn't say Kaddish Shalom. And maybe nobody picked up on it right away. So they said Hallel, the Chazan said Chatzi Kaddish, and now they go right away to laning. And now they're laning, and somebody comes up to the Gabbai in the middle of laning, says, I think we have a little bit of a problem. I think the Chazan failed to say Kaddish Shalom after Hallel. I think he only said Chatzi Kaddish. Vos Tutman, what do we do now? Kosav Again Reb Chaim Kanievsky, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, Sha'alachar Krias HaTorah, in such a case, after laning, normally after laning, the Baal Kairei says a Chatzi Kaddish. Says Reb Chaim Kanievsky, in a case where they neglected to say a proper Kaddish Sholem after Hallel, so they haven't yet been Messiahim Tefillah Shacharis, they didn't close off Shacharis with a Kaddish Sholem, so then La'achar Krias HaTorah Yochel Loimer Kaddish Tiskabel B'Makom Chatzi Kaddish. You should say a Kaddish Sholem after the laning to serve as the closure on Tefillah Shacharis. What do you do when you have a different chazan for Hallel? Why does this happen? Well, I can tell you that our minig in Yeshiva Staten Island is that if we have an oval, if we have a chiyuv who davens Shacharis every day, so we allow a chiyuv to daven for the Amid on Rosh Chodesh, but he cannot say Hallel. So we would have the chiyuv daven Shacharis until after Chazar Hashatz. After Chazar Hashatz, the chiyuv steps away from the Amid, and a different chazan comes and says Hallel. And then after Hallel, the original chazan takes his place. It says here in the footnote, Kishem eschalev shatz likriyas Hallel. When you have a different chazan to say Hallel, haminigu the minigish shatz harishain omer sakadish teskabel. The substitute shliach tzibur only says Hallel. He doesn't say the Kaddish Tiskabel, the Kaddish Sholem after Hallel. For that, the original Chazan comes back. He is the one who's going to recite the Kaddish Sholem after Hallel. Im Hashatz Hasheni Shama as Kol Chazaras Hashatz. Having said that, says Reb Chaim Kanievsky, not Reb Chaim Kanievsky, this is not, this is Miyuchas to Reb Chaim Kanievsky. What happens if, for some reason, the replacement Shliach Tzibur who came to the Amud for Hallel, if he's going to go ahead and say the Kaddish? Really, the original one should say the Kaddish, because he's the Chazan that was there for Shacharis. He's the Chazan who said Chazaras Hashatz. The Kaddish Sholem is going back on Shacharis. So by right, and the proper thing would be that the original Chazan should be the one to say the Kaddish Sholem, not the replacement. Having said that, says Reb Chaim Kanievsky, if the replacement Chazan comported himself in the proper way during the Chazaras Hashatz of Shacharis, meaning that he listened to the whole Chazaras Hashatz and he had kavana to the Chazaras Hashatz, so then he could also say the Kaddish Sholem. I guess this might come up if, let's say, you had the Chazan Rishon, the original Chazan, the oval, he davened Shacharis. He said Chazaras Hashatz. He stepped away for the Amid. The substitute Chazan came to go ahead and say Hallel. Then maybe the original Chazan, let's say, had to go to the Beis HaKisei. So the original Chazan stepped out. He's not there. Now Hallel is over. We got to say Kaddish Sholem. So now they want the replacement Chazan to be the one to say the Kaddish Sholem. Says Reb Chaim, if he listened and he paid attention to the whole Chazaras Hashatz, then it's still appropriate that he could also say the Kaddish Sholem, because he also had a Chazaras Hashatz. Shemei Koina, he went, he listened, he had kavana, so he could say the Kaddish Sholem as well. Kasav Agon Reb Chaim Kanievsky Zatzal, Shemistaber, in such a case it would make sense. Shagam hu yochel loimer sakadish teskabel sha'acher Hallel. Okay, let's go back here to the Mechaber. So we said Hallel, we said Kaddish Sholem after Hallel. We are now up to laning. Says the Mechaber, we see in Sefer Torah, we take out a Sefer Torah, b'karim by arba'a, and we lane 4 aliyas from the Sefer Torah. Why 4 aliyas? Because on a regular Sheni v'chamishi, on a regular Monday and a Thursday, which is a regular weekday, we lane 3 aliyas, Kaya Levi and Yisrael. Rosh Chodesh has a higher level of Kedusha, so we have to add. So we add a 4th aliyah to show that Rosh Chodesh has a higher level of Kedusha than a regular weekday. But we're not going to make it 5 aliyas. 5 aliyas is already Yom Tov. Rosh Chodesh is not mamish a Yom Tov, even though we have seen that there's a shtickle, a concept of moyed on Rosh Chodesh, u'baroshet chodshechem, u'v'moyadechem. So yes, there is a certain aspect of moyed on Rosh Chodesh, but Rosh Chodesh is not aser ba'asiyas malacha, so it's not mamish a Yom Tov. So it's a step above, it's elevated above a regular weekday. Thus, it gets 4 aliyas. It's not quite a Yom Tov. It doesn't get 5 aliyas. Also, there's an inyan of bittul malacha. Since Rosh Chodesh is mutter ba'asiyas malacha, people have to go to work. And Chazal were very sensitive to this. Chazal were very sensitive to the idea that people do have to go to work, and we can't take away time from their arbit. We can't take away time. We can't take away hours from them. It's not right. So yes, we give a fourth aliyah, but not 5. And to that end, says the Mechaber, Ein Peiches in Mehem. You cannot do less than 4 aliyahs. It must have one more than a regular weekday. Ve'ein Meisifet aliyah. But at the same time, you cannot add. Ve'ein Maftirin Benavi, and there is no HaTorah. Moving along to Sif Beis, we come to the complicated laning of Rosh Chodesh. So before we embark on Sif Beis, it's kedai to familiarize ourselves a little bit with the parshas in the Torah that we lane for the Rosh Chodesh laning. So the Rosh Chodesh laning is to be found in Sefer Bamidbar, beginning with Perek Chav Ches, Pasuk Aleph. Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Lemar, Tzavis b'nei Yisrael va'amarta aleihem as karbani lachmi li'ishai rech nichayach tishberu lahakriv li b'mayadoi. This is the beginning, really, of the parsha of the carbon tamid. So the laning on Rosh Chodesh consists of 3 parshiyos, not 3 parshiyos in the colloquial sense of parshiyos, Bereshis, Noach, and Lech Lecha, 3 parshiyos in the Torah. We know that the parshiyos in the Torah are separated. If you look inside the writing of a Sefer Torah, you'll see gaps. You'll see between psukim, you'll see different sized gaps. Those are what we call stumais and psuchais. There are gaps that separate the individual parshiyos of the Torah. Again, when I say the individual parshiyos of the Torah, I don't mean Bereshis and Noach. What I mean is that the Torah HaKadosh is divided up into small sections, some bigger, some smaller, and they're separated by these stumais and psuchais. And if you open up a chumash, you'll see the peis and the samachs. The pei stands for psucha. The samach stands for stuma. There's a difference between a psucha and a stuma. When you look inside the Sefer Torah, the size of the gap that separates those parshiyos in the Torah is different if it's a psucha or it's a stuma. So the laning on Rosh Chodesh consists of 3 different parshiyos. We have Perek Chav Ches, Pasuk Aleph through Pasuk Ches, 8 psukim. That's one parsha. Then we have Perek Chav Ches, Pasuk Tes, Uveyoim HaShabbos. So the first parsha discusses the regular carbon tamid that was brought twice every day. You have the Tamid Shel Shachar, the Tamid Shel Bein Haraboyim. That's the first parsha. Again, it's Pasuk Aleph through Ches, 8 psukim. The second parsha consists of 2 psukim. It's Pasuk Tes and Pasuk Yud. What is that parsha? Uveyom HaShabbos. It tells us about the carbon musaf that was brought on Shabbos. Ubiyam HaShabbos shnei chvasim b'nei shana timimim u'shtei esrei nisayos mincha b'lav Hashem v'niskai Ayla Shabbos b'Shabbat Ayla Satamid v'Niska. That's the carbon musaf of Shabbos. So again, that is the second parsha of the Rosh Chodesh laning. Then we have the third parsha. The third parsha begins with Pasuk Yud Aleph, and it runs through Pasuk Tes Vav. That is really the part of the laning that pertains to Rosh Chodesh. And indeed, it begins, Uveroshe Chotshechem Takrivu Oila Hashem. It's this last parsha, the third parsha of the laning that we lane on Rosh Chodesh. That's where we discuss the carbon musaf of Rosh Chodesh. Now, when it comes to laning, there are a few rules that we have to bear in mind. These are all halachas that we learned back in Chelik Aleph when we were Chelik Beis, when we were learning the halachas of Krias HaTorah. So one solid, hard, fast rule is that you cannot have an aliyah of less than 3 psukim. An aliyah has to have at least 3 psukim. There's no such thing as a 2 pasuk aliyah or a 1 pasuk aliyah. So that's rule number 1. Rule number 2, when you have an aliyah cannot end so that after that aliyah, there are only 2 psukim left in that parsha. So to use Rosh Chodesh as an example, I told you that the first parsha, not the first aliyah, the first parsha of the laning on Rosh Chodesh begins with Perek Chav Ches Pasuk Aleph, and it ends with Perek Chav Ches Pasuk Ches. So that parsha has 8 psukim. Now, you would not be able to end an aliyah by Pasuk Vav. Pasuk Vav cannot be the last pasuk of an aliyah. Why? Because then all that would be left, all that would be remaining in that parsha after that aliyah would be Pasuk Zayin and Pasuk Ches. So, for example, you could not have the Levi end his aliyah at the end of Pasuk Vav, because then that means that the Levi is going to close off his aliyah with the second bracha of his aliyah. And if you look at the Chumash, all that's going to be left to that parsha, not all that's going to be left to the laning, all that's going to be left to that parsha is going to be Pasuk Zayin and Pasuk Ches. You can't end an aliyah when there are only 2 psukim left to the parsha. Why is that? Because the Gemara Megillah says, Chazal were afraid. Somebody is unfortunately in a rush to get out of shul for whatever reason. We're going to hope that he has an oinus. Something is forcing him to leave. So he's leaving davening early. So he listened to the second aliyah. He listened to the Levi's aliyah. He saw that the Levi ended his aliyah with Pasuk Vav. He looks in the Chumash. He sees that all that's left to the parsha is Pasuk Zayin and Pasuk Ches. He's a shtickle on Amoritz. He doesn't know what the laning for a Chodesh really is. And he's going to think to himself, oh, if the Levi ended his aliyah with Pasuk Vav, and there are 2 aliyahs left to the end of the parsha, that probably means that the next aliyah, Shlishi, is only going to be Pasuk Zayin and Pasuk Ches. What's the logic? Well, he looks in the Chumash, and he sees there's only 2 psukim left of the parsha. Mistama, the next aliyah is going to lane to the end of the parsha, which means that the next aliyah is going to be 2 aliyahs. But we don't want him to make that mistake, because the halacha is that an aliyah is not allowed to have two psukim. Can't be. So we don't want somebody to make a mistake and think he's going to reach a wrong conclusion. He's going to see that the aliyah ended and there's only 2 psukim left of the parsha. He's going to assume, a wrong assumption, he's going to assume that the next aliyah is only going to be 2 psukim. We don't want him to think that. Why? Because it's not true. You're not allowed to have an aliyah that's only 2 psukim. So there are these rules that pertain to how the aliyahs of the laning have to be constructed. And because of those rules, we're going to end up with a situation here on Rosh Chodesh where we're going to have a very unusual Krias HaTorah. And most people are very familiar with this. What's so unusual about the Rosh Chodesh laning? Well, we're going to call up the Kayin for the first aliyah. Now, an aliyah can't have less than 3 psukim, right? So we're going to call up the Kayin. The Kayin is going to make his first bracha of his aliyah. The Balkar is going to say Amen. And then the Balkar is going to lane 3 psukim. Pasuk Aleph, Vayidaber Shem Moshe Lemar. Pasuk Beis, Tzavis B'nei Yisrael V'amart Aleim Es Karbani Lachvi Li'ishai V'ech Nichayach Tishburu L'Hakriv Li B'mayadoi. Pasuk Gimel, V'amart Alehem Zeh Ha'isha Shetikruv L'Hashem Kvasa B'nei Shanas V'im Rishtar Malayam L'Samit. Okay, the Kayin had a beautiful aliyah, 3 psukim. He's going to make the second bracha of his aliyah. He's done. We're going to call up the Levi. We're going to call up the Levi. Is the Balkari going to continue with Pasuk Dalet? No. He's going to go back to the beginning of Pasuk Gimel. And he is going to lane another 3 psukim. But he's going to repeat Pasuk Gimel. So he's going to lane Pasuk Gimel, which he already laned for the Kayin. Then he's going to lane Pasuk Dalet, and then the last Pasuk of the Aliyah, Pasuk number 3 of the Aliyah, is going to be Pasuk Hey. So you're going to use 5 psukim for 2 Aliyahs, not 6, 5. Kayin is going to be Pasuk Aleph, Beis, and Gimel. Levi is going to be Pasuk Gimel. You're going to repeat Pasuk Gimel, Dalid, and Hey. Then you're going to call up Shlishi. Shlishi is going to lane Pasuk Vav, Pasuk Zayin, and Pasuk Ches, 3 psukim, but he's not going to end over there. The Shlishi is going to have 5 psukim. He's going to continue with Pasuk Tes, over Yom HaShabbos. This is the next parsha already. And Pasuk Yud, Oil Shabbos B'Shabbatoi, which is the end of the second parsha. So again, the Kayin is going to be the first 3 psukim. The Levi is going to repeat pasuk number 3 and do 3, 4, and 5. The Shlishi is going to have 5 psukim. He's going to have Vav, Zayin, and Ches, which are the last 3 psukim of the first parsha, and psukim Tes and Yud, which are the 2 psukim of the second parsha. And then finally, the Revi, the 4th aliyah that we're adding for Rosh Chodesh, that's going to be the parsha of Uvarashei Chachechem, and that's going to be a nice-sized laning. It's going to be a nice-sized aliyah. Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel, Yud Dalid, and Tesvav. It's going to be 5 psukim. So what's unusual about the Rosh Chodesh laning is that we're going to have this repetition. By the second aliyah, we're going to repeat pasuk Gimel. We're going to shift it to reverse, and we're going to repeat one of the psukim that we already laned for the Kayin. And the reason we're going to do this is because we're going to do the math, and because of the rules, some of which I already explained to you, because of the rules about how a laning has to be constructed, we're going to be put into a pickle, and we're going to have to do this unusual thing, and we're going to have to repeat a pasuk. Against that backdrop, let's see Sif Beis. Says the Mechaber. The Karei HaKayin Shloisha Psukim. So for the Kayin, now the Mechaber writes it as V'Karei HaKayin Shloisha Psukim. The Kayin is going to read 3 psukim. Why does the Mechaber write it that way? Because let's remember that back in the day, we didn't have a Bal Kairei and then people who came up for aliyahs. We called up somebody for an aliyah, and the person who came up for the aliyah was the one who laned his aliyah. So if we had 4 aliyahs, we had 4 balei kriya. We called up the Kayin laned his aliyah. We called up the Levi laned his aliyah. We called up the Shlishi, he laned his aliyah. We called up the Revi, he laned his aliyah. We don't do that anymore because unfortunately people aren't bucky. They're not familiar enough with the laning, and not everybody could lane their own aliyah. So we have this new minig that we have a Bal Kaira who lanes. So by the way, if you're a Bal Kaira and you're listening to this share, one thing that comes out of that halacha is that when you're a Bal Kaira, you have to listen to the brachas of the oila, and you have to be yoitza with the brachas of the oila. The oila is being moitzi you, the Bal Kaira, in the brachas that allows you to go lane the laning and be moitzi the tzibur. Just something that Balei Kriya have to be familiar with that a lot of Balei Kriya don't know. So again, says the Mechaber, V'Karei HaKayin Shloisha Psukim. The Kayin is going to read 3 psukim, or in our minig, the Bal Kairei is going to lane the first 3 psukim on behalf of the Kayin's aliyah. What are those 3 psukim? Pasuk Aleph, Vayidaber Shalom Moshe Lemar. Pasuk Beis, Tzavis Bnei Yisrael. Pasuk Gimel, V'amarta Alehem. So he's going to lane Pasuk Aleph, Pasuk Beis, and Pasuk Gimel, and that's going to be the end of the Kayin's aliyah. The Levi, and then when you call up the Levi, Chayzer V'Kairei V'amarta. He's going to repeat Pasuk Gimel. He's going to repeat Pasuk Gimel V'amarta Alehem. V'Kairei, and then he'll continue and he'll lane Pasuk Dalet as a kevesecha tasav abliker, and then he'll lane Pasuk Hey V'asiris Ha'efa. So from the first 5 psukim, you got 2 aliyahs, the Kayin and the Levi. The Yisrael, and then the Yisrael that you call up for Shlishi, Kairei Olas Tamid. He's going to continue with Pasuk Vav, Olas Tamid, Ad Uberoshe Chachechem. So he's going to lane the last 3 psukim of the first parsha, right? He's going to lane Vav, Zayin, and Ches. Then he's going to lane Tes and Yud, Uviyom HaShabbos, and what is it? Uviyom HaShabbos, and Ola Shabbos B'Shabbatoi. And that's going to bring us up to Uveroshe Chachechem, or Revi, and then the Revi, the 4th aliyah that we're adding, L'chodesh Chodesh, Kairei Uveroshe Chachechem. He will pick up with Uveroshe Chachechem ad Hasoif until the end of that parsha and the end of the Rosh Chodesh laning. So the Mechaber lays out the Chiddush. The Mechaber lays out the unusual aspect of the Rosh Chodesh laning. He lays out the exact format and construct of the laning. He does not explain, though, why we do something which is so highly unusual. And for that, we have the Mishnah Berurah. And the Mishnah Berurah is going to bring down some other minhagim, some other ways that some places lane the Rosh Chodesh laning as well. Says the Mishnah Berurah's Cotton Bave. Hatam. The reason for this unusual kriya is before Gemara. It's explained in the Gemara in Megillah Chaf Aleph Amud Beis and Chaf Beis Amud Aleph. Mishum deleka beparsha zu ela shmoina psukim. The problem that we have is, in the first of the three parshiyos that we lay for the Rosh Chodesh lighting, beginning with Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe Lemor until Ubiyoyim HaShabbos, which is the first pasuk of the next parsha, in that first parsha, we only have Ela Shmoina Psukim. We only have 8 psukim in that parsha, and we have a problem with how to break up those 8 psukim. And the Mishnah Berurah explains the problem. V'imke, now that we only have 8 psukim, what do? Im Yikra HaLevi Kedarkoi Shloisha Psukim, right? You would say, okay, there's 8 psukim. All right, so very good. Let the Kohen, let the first aliyah be the first 3 psukim. Pasuk Aleph, Pasuk Beis, and Pasuk Gimel. No problem. Then let the Levi lane the next 3 psukim. So the Kohen, Pasuk Aleph, Pasuk Beis, Pasuk Gimel, 3 aliyahs, no problem. The Levi, Pasuk Dalet, Pasuk Hey, Pasuk Vav, another 3 aliyahs. Beautiful aliyah, no problem. Kohen and Levi taken care of with 6 psukim. Each one of them had 3 psukim. But now we have a problem. You can't end Levi with Pasuk Vav. You know why? Because Lo Yishtar B'Parsha El Shtei Psukim. So how many psukim are remaining in this parsha? Only 2. Only Pasuk Zayin and Pasuk Ches. Once you finish Pasuk Ches, you came to a stuma. A psucha, actually, not a stuma. Psucha. So you're now at the end of a parsha. So you only have 2 psukim remaining to the parsha. The Kamalana we paskin, the ein mishayrim shnei psukim l'fnei parsha. You're not allowed to end 2 psukim before the end of a parsha. You're not allowed to end an aliyah where there are only 2 psukim left to the parsha. Ukidela el reish siman kof lamed ches, like we learned in kof lamed ches. And again, the reason is because if somebody walks out of shul at that moment, he's going to look in the chumash. He's going to assume that, it must be that the shlishi is only going to lay 2 psukim. And he's going to conclude that you're allowed to have 2 psukim in an aliyah, and that's not true. So you can't do that. You can't make Kohen, Pasuk Aleph, Pasuk Beis, Pasuk Gimel, Levi, Pasuk Dalet, Pasuk Hey, Pasuk Vav. That's not an 8, so you can't do that. Okay, fine. So you can't do that. So says the Mishnah Berurah, all right, maybe let's do something different. The lekala neimar deloy likru b'parsha zu ella koyin v'levi. Maybe you'll say, all right, what's the problem? In this first parsha, how many psukim do we have? We have 8 psukim. So why don't we just do 4 and 4? Let the koyin do aleph, beis, gimel, and dalet. Let the Levi do hey, vav, zayin, and ches. So you have 8 psukim in this parsha, divided equally between the koyin and the Levi, right? 4 and 4. And then what will the shlishi be? Well, the shlishi is going to have to start with Uviyoyim HaShabbos. Now you have a conundrum, because now shlishi is going to start with Uviyoyim HaShabbos. How many psukim are there in the parsha of Uviyoyim HaShabbos? Only 2. So that's not an aliyah on its own. So for shlishi, you're going to have to lane the 2 psukim of Uviyoyim HaShabbos. You can't stop then, because you only have 2 psukim. So you're going to have to go into the parsha of Uvaroshe Chachechem. Now, once you go into the parsha of Uvaroshe Chachechem, you're going to have to lane at least 3 psukim in the parsha of Uvaroshe Chachechem. Why? Because you're not allowed to end an aliyah within 2 psukim of the beginning of a parsha. So you can't lane, in our case, the shlishi cannot do the 2 psukim of Uviyoyim HaShabbos, and then let's say only pasuk Yud Aleph, the first pasuk of the next parsha, so that he has 3 psukim. Can't do that. You know why? Because then you went into the next parsha with only 1 pasuk, and you ended an aliyah. Why is that a problem? Because what if somebody walks into shul late, and he walks in right when the shlishi ends his aliyah? So he sees that the shlishi ends his aliyah at the end of pasuk Yud Aleph. He's going to look at a chumash, and he's going to say, wow, pasuk Yud Aleph is the first pasuk of a new parsha. It's the first pasuk of this parsha that begins with Uvaroshe Chachechem. And he just ended his aliyah. It must be that his aliyah was only 1 pasuk. So he's going to make a mistake, and he's going to think, you can have an aliyah that's 1 pasuk. So you can't end an aliyah within 3 psukim of the beginning of a parsha. So if the shlishi is going to start by pasuk tes, he's going to start with Uviyoyim HaShabbos, he's going to have to do pasuk tes, pasuk yud, right? He finished the parsha. He only has 2 psukim. He has to go weiter. He's going to have to do Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, and Yud Gimel. Now he went 3 psukim into the next parsha. All right, what is that going to leave for Revi? That's going to leave for Revi only Yud Dalid and Tesvav. Once you come, Tesvav is the end of the Rosh Chodesh laning. So now the Revi only has 2 psukim. You can't have an aliyah that's only 2 psukim. Let's see this inside in the Mishnah Berurah. So again, you might say, let's take the first 8 psukim of the first parsha of this laning. Let's take those first 8 psukim and divide it up between the Kohen and the Levi. V'ashlishi v'aravi yikru b'parshas u'b'yoyim ha'Shabbos u'b'parshas the Rosh Chodesh, and then make 2 aliyahs out of the second and the third parsha, the parsha of U'b'yoyim ha'Shabbos and the parsha of U'v'rosh Chodeshechem. Says the Chavetz Chaim, that's not an eitzah. Gam zeh yefshir, that's not going to work. Why? Because what I just told you. The parsha, the Shabbos leka elishnei psukim. The parsha of U'v'yoyim ha'Shabbos is only 2 psukim. You can't have an aliyah, only 2 psukim. V'alkein yeh tzarich l'sayim l'shlishi be'ezeh psukim b'parsha the Rosh Chodesh. Now the shlishi is going to have to continue into the parsha of U'v'rosh Chodeshechem. How far into that parsha is he going to have to go? Since we learned that Hilchos Krias HaTorah, that once you go into a new parsha, you must lane at least 3 psukim into the new parsha. So you're going to have to go 3 psukim into U'v'rosh Chodeshechem. So you're going to have to use Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, and Yud Gimel, the first 3 psukim of U'v'rosh Chodeshechem. You're going to have to use them for the shlishi, and then lo yishtar b'parsha the Rosh Chodesh l'fnei Revi el shtei psukim. So then you can only have less left for Revi. Yud Daled and Tesvav, you can only have 2 psukim for him. Levi shei kula rak chamisha psukim. The whole last parsha is only 5 psukim, and you just used up 3 of them for shlishi. So for Revi, you only have 2 psukim left. V'alkein tzarich lases kanal. So that's why, he explains the Mishnah Berurah, the eitzah is the mechaber's eitzah. Begin the laning, give the Kohen the first 3 psukim of the laning, Aleph, Beis, and Gimel. Then repeat pasuk Gimel and give the Levi Gimel, Dalet, and Hey. Then call up the Shlishi, give the Shlishi the last 3 psukim of the first parsha, Vav, Zayin, and Ches, and the 2 psukim of the second parsha, U'v'yom HaShabbos, give him those 2 psukim, and then for the Revi, give him all 5 psukim of U'v'rosh Chodeshechem. And now everything is fine. Everybody had 3 psukim. You always stayed within the guidelines of Hilchos Krias HaTorah. You didn't end off an aliyah with leaving only 2 psukim left to the end of the parsha. You didn't start off a parsha and go less than 3 psukim into the parsha, and everything is wonderful. It all works. Okay, now let's go to Mishnah Berurah Gimel. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Revi Karei B'Rosh Chodeshechem. Says the Mishnah Berurah, having said all this, the Das HaBach, it's the opinion of the Bach and the Pri Chodesh. They had a different way of cutting it up. They were faced with the same problem, but they cut it up in a different way. V'das HaBach u'Pri Chodesh, sheyoser tov l'sayim la'shlishi ad u'b'yoyim ha'Shabbos. They wanted that the way you should break it up is that the first 3 aliyahs should use up the first 8 psukim. You should make 3 aliyahs out of the first 8 psukim, out of the first parsha. So Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael should all end before U'b'yoyim HaShabbos. How would that work? So according to the Bach and the Pri Chodesh, what you would do is like this. The Kohen would get pasuk Aleph, Beis, and Gimel, same way we did it before. The Levi is going to repeat pasuk Gimel, and he's going to get Gimel, Dalet, and Hey, the same way we do it, our minig. And then the Yisrael is going to get the next 3 psukim, Vav, Zayin, and Ches. That's going to be the end of Shlishi. Now, we don't do that. We do Kohen, Aleph, Beis, Gimel. That's the same. We do Levi, Gimel, Dalet, Hey. That's the same. And then for Shlishi, we do Vav, Zayin, Ches, Tes, and Yud. We give the Shlishi 5 psukim, all the way till over Rosh Chodesh. It helps to follow this, to have a chumash or a siddur open in front of you. That's the way we do it. The Bach and the Pri Chodesh, they make one change. They give the Kohen Aleph, Beis, and Gimel. They give the Levi Gimel, Dalet, and Hey. They only give the Yisrael Vav, Zayin, and Ches. And they stop by Uviyom HaShabbos. V'haravi Yikra Uviyom HaShabbos at Sefer Kriya. And then for Ravi, they expand Ravi. Instead of starting Ravi by Uvarosh Chachechem, they start Ravi 2 psukim early by Uviyom HaShabbos. That's the way they do it. Why do they do it that way? Why do the Bach and the Pri Chodesh like that better? Because the Bach and the Pri Chodesh had an interesting problem. The Bach and the Pri Chodesh said, if we're going to start, we see that in Hilchos Krias HaTorah, we're all afraid of somebody who's leaving shul early, coming to shul late, looking in the Chumash and making a mistake, making an invalid halachic assumption. Says the Bach and the Pri Chodesh, if that's what you're worried about, if we're going to cut it up the way we do, so that the Revi is going to start with Uberosh Chachechem. What happens? Somebody comes late to shul, and he sees that the Revi starts his aliyah with Uberosh Chachechem. He looks in the Chumash, and he says, what came before Uberosh Chachechem? A very small parsha, a parsha of 2 psukim, Uviyom HaShabbos and Oil Shabbos B'Shabbaton. Oh, it must be that was the Shlishi. If I see that the Revi is starting from Uberosh Chachechem, it must be that the Shlishi was the previous parsha, which is only 2 psukim. And they're going to make a mistake and think that an aliyah could have 2 psukim. So that's why the Bach and the Pri Chodesh tweak the laning the way they do. Okay. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, Pri Megadim says our method is better. V'da, and you should know, and this gra that we're about to learn got me in trouble many years ago when I was in a certain place that I'm not going to name, a certain yeshiva, and they had no Bal Koreh on Rosh Chodesh. Happens to be that it was Rosh Chodesh Av, and I was in this yeshiva by Shacharis, by Krias HaTorah. They took out the Sefer Torah, they put it on the bima, and they didn't have a Bal Koreh. So they looked around for a Bal Koreh. So I'm a Bal Koreh, so I got up and I went to lane. And I broke up the aliyahs the way we do. And I started getting clops on the table and people yelling, no, you're breaking up the laning wrong. Because in this yeshiva, they follow the minhag hagra that we're about to hear right now. Very unusual. This is not common. Here in the United States, highly uncommon. In Eretz Yisrael, it's more common. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you should know the hagra chaylik ha'ikr dina da b'chaber. The gra disagrees with this whole machaber. Uladaita, in his opinion, Seder HaKriya b'Rosh Chodesh u'kein. The format of lading on Rosh Chodesh is as follows: Kohen kairish shloisha psukim. The Kohen, Aleph, Beis, and Gimel. V'halevi chamisha ad soif haparsha. So the Kohen gets pasuk Aleph, psukim Aleph, Beis, and Gimel. The Levi continues from where the Kohen left off. We don't repeat. We're going to give the Levi 5 psukim. The remaining 5 psukim in the first parsha: Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, and Ches. So the Levi is going to end right before Uviyom HaShabbos. So you took the first 8 psukim of the laning and you divided it up between the Kohen and the Levi. You gave the Kohen the first 3, you gave the Levi the next 5, and now you're up to Uviyom HaShabbos. Okay? Vashlishi, now the Shlishi, Choizer v'kairei shloisha psukim ha'akroidim b'parsha shekaru. Now you're going to go into reverse, and for Shlishi, you're going to go back to pasuk Vav. Oilas tamid ha'asuya bar Sinai. And for Shlishi, you're going to lane pasuk Vav, pasuk Zayin, pasuk Ches, and the kairei ubiyom HaShabbos ad parsha Rosh Chodesh. And then you're going to lane, you're also going to give Shlishi, Tes, and Yud, Ubiyom HaShabbos and Oil Shabbos. And then the Revi is going to be the Revi the way we do it. The Revi Kar b'Parsha Rosh Chodesh, Vayin b'Bir Halacha, where he explains the Shitas HaGra. So the Gra is also going to shift in reverse. We, in our minig, we only end up repeating 1 pasuk. In the Gra's minig, you actually end up repeating 3 psukim. But that's the minhag hagra, and believe it or not, there are places that follow that minig. And this is an interesting biur halacha. If you want to go through this biur halacha of a levi chayzer v'karei, we simply don't have time for it, so I'm going to go weiter. Okay, boy, and everybody thought that the days of overly long shiurim ended with the end of Iruvei Tchumen. Okay, moving along to Sif Gimel, says the Mechaber. Omer Kaddish. All right, we finished laning. At the end of laning, the Baal Koreh says a Chatzi Kaddish. So we're going to have a Chatzi Kaddish here. Omer Kaddish. After this Chatzi Kaddish, what's the next step? Va'ashrei uvolot tzion. Now we're going to say Ashrei and uvolot tzion. Ve'ein oimrim yancha Hashem b'yom tzara, but we're not going to say Lam natzech b'zvul David yancha Hashem b'yom tzara. Why are we not going to say Lam Natseach? Because Rosh Chodesh is a shtickle, a yomtiv, is a shtickle, a moyed, and therefore it's inappropriate to have Lam Natseach. So we laned, we said Chatzi Kaddish, we said Ashrei uvolot tzion. The Mechaber doesn't mention over here that after Ashrei uvolot tzion, we're going to have a Chatzi Kaddish. Let's take a look here in the Mishnah Berurah. It says the Mishnah Berurah is cut Daled. Omer Kaddish, after we says the Mishnah Berurah is cut Daled. Omer Kaddish, Hainu Chatzi Kaddish Omer al Habima al Sefer Torah. This Kaddish that the Mechaber says Omer Kaddish is a reference to the Chatzi Kaddish by the Bima after laning. Then we say Ashrei uvolot tzion. The Chatzi Kaddish b'shul apsukim b'shul Ashrei uvolot tzion. After Ashrei uvolot tzion, we have a Chatzi Kaddish that goes back on the recitation of the psukim of Ashrei uvolot tzion. Continues the Mechaber. All right. So we had the Chatzi Kaddish after laning. We had Ashrei uvolot tzion without Lam Natzech. We had a Chatzi Kaddish after Ashrei uvolot tzion. U'machzir sefer Torah l'mikoymai. Now, and this is the Mechaber, and Mechaber is describing what happens according to Nusach Sfard, and that's why he didn't mention the Kaddish yet, the Kaddish after Ashrei uvolot tzion, because now U'machzir sefer Torah l'mikoymai, right? Nusach Sfard does this. Nusach Ashkenaz puts the sefer Torah away right after laning. Laning, Chatzi Kaddish, Hag b'Galila, put the sefer Torah away. Ashrei uvolot tzion, Chatzi Kaddish. Nusach Sfard is laning, Chatzi Kaddish, Ashrei laning, Hag b'Galila, Chatzi Kaddish, Ashrei uvolot tzion, then Machzir Sefer Torah l'mikoymai, then you put the Sefer Torah away, then you have Chatzi Kaddish. V'oimdim lehispal tfilas musaf, and then we go to daven tfilas musaf. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Heyu Machzir Sefer Torah. This is again the minig of Nusach Sfard. Uv'mekaymenu, Chavetz Chaim says in our regions where they daven Ashkenaz, Shemachzirin Sefer Torah lahechol b'yad achar Kriya, we put the Sefer Torah back right after laning. K'van shekasav haramah b'soif Siman Chafei Sif Yud Gimel. Ois cut vav. Then we go to daven tfilas musaf. Says the Mishnah Berurah v'yesh eza shinei nuscha'os. We find different textual variations in the recitation of the Musaf Shemona Esrei. Yesh garsin zikaron lechulam hayu. There are those that say Rosh Chodeshim la'amcha nasata zman kapar lechol toldoisam zikaron lekulam hayu. Lashon avar. There was a zikaron. There was a remembrance for Klal Yisrael back in the day when we had a Beis HaMikdash and we were able to bring the Musafim in the Beis HaMikdash. The yesh garsin zikaron lechulam yihiyu. There are those that say no, there will be lashon hoive. There's a zikaron even now that we don't have, that we can't actually bring the karbanos, but unishal maparim sfasenu. We're going to daven musaf, and Rosh Chodesh is still going to be a zikaron for us. The yesh amram zikaron lechulanu yihiyeh. Lechulanu yihiyeh. For all of us yihiyeh. Again, lashon hoive. Vein l'shanei shom minig, and the Mishnah Berurah says, whatever the minig in your locale is, you don't change the minig. Tzarech leimar uminchasam v'niskehem. In the Musaf, after we describe the Karban Musaf, we say uminchasam v'niskehem kimedubar, and then we describe the Karban Mincha. There is a textual variation that did not say v'niskehem, says the Chavetz Chaim, we should say v'niskehem. Why didn't they say v'niskehem? Because the truth is that in the Musaf Shemona Esrei, we don't describe the nisachim of the Karban Musaf. So therefore it's a little inappropriate to say v'niskehem kimedubar. Yesha Kasver, there are those that write shetzarech loimer es musaf, the Yesha Kasver shetzarech loimer ve'es musaf. So again, textual variations. V'chen yesh omer l'chaparas pasha. when we say Elokeinu v'Elokei Aviseinu, and we say that the Rebbeinu Shalom Sheba Mechadish Aleinu Es HaChodesh Hazeh L'Toiva V'Levracha L'Sasi L'Simcha, we have a lot of Lashonos over there. And if you look at it, there are 12 Lashonos. And then there's a 13th. L'Bechilas Chet U'L'Slichas Avain, and then the 13th Lashon, the 13th phrase, is Ulechaparas Pasha. So the Chavetz Chaim says, V'chein yesh oimrim Ulechaparas Pasha. There are those that add in Ulechaparas Pasha every single month of the year, whether it's a leap year, whether it's not a leap year, they always say Ulechaparas Pasha. V'yesh she'ein oimrim rak b'shtasa ibor. There are those that only add Ulechaparas Pasha during a leap year. Why? Because, like I said, there are 12 phrases. Ulechaparas Pasha is the 13th. So in a leap year, when we have an Adar Sheni and we have 13 months, you add in Ulechaparas Pasha. Even during a leap year, we also have different minhagim. There are those that only add in Ulechaparas Pasha during a leap year, only until the end of Adar Sheni. So when at the conclusion of the leap month, at the conclusion of the extra month that we add, Adar Sheni, they drop Ulechaparas Pasha. And then there are those that know, if it's a leap year, they say Ulechaparas Pasha for the entire year. And there are different minhagim. Literally, this means each river should follow its own path. Everybody should follow the minig in his locale. Let's say somebody went to daven Musaf and he got a little bit spaced out, unfortunately, and he went and he davened the regular Shemona Esrei. He didn't daven Musaf. He davened a regular Vachadik Shemona Esrei. La Yotza. He's not Yotza Musaf. He didn't mention the Karbanos Musaf. I feel his Yalav Yavai. Even if he mentioned Kedushas Hayoim, even if he said a Shemona Esrei with Yalav Yavai, you're not Yotza Musaf. You didn't mention the Karbanos. So you didn't mention Musaf. You're not Yotza Musaf. V'tzarch Lasser L'Spal. You have to daven over again. Vatam, the reason is Pasha. The Tzarch Lasker Karbanos HaMusafim. In order for it to be a Tfilas Musaf, you have to mention the Karbanos HaMusafim. Miyu, however, if he inserted into one of the brachas, if he stuck in an interesting text somewhere in the middle of his Vachadik Shemona Esrei, we should be Zaycha, we should be able to bring the Karbanos, the Tamidim, and the Karbanos Musaf. He didn't even describe the Karbanos Musaf, but he mentioned them, Uber Karbanos Musafim, Yatza, he would be Yatza, Ukitaleil B'Sim Reis Amaches, Siv Dalet, highly unadvisable. By the way, I heard a fascinating story about people who lived in Siberia in the 80s who had been totally cut off from Jewish civilization since before World War II. And they would daven a weekday Shemona Esrei on Shabbos with Yalav Yavai, and they would say, V'zachrenu b'yom HaShabbos hazeh. They did not know that there was a Shabbos Shemona Esrei. They davened a Vachadik Shemona Esrei on Shabbos, and they put it in Yalav Yavai, and they mentioned Shabbos in Yalav Yavai. Fascinating. Says the Mechaber Vayter. So, Umachser Shliach, 3 lines off the bottom, near the beginning of the line. So, you're going to daven Musaf, and then Umachser Shliach HaTzibur HaTfilah, then the Chazan is going to say Chazaras HaShatz of Tfilas Musaf. V'omer Keser, and the Mechaber, again, this is Nusach Sfard. When it comes to Kedusha, you don't say the regular Kedusha, either of Nakdishach in Nusach Sfard, or the Kadesh in Nusach Ashkaz, or Na'aritzcha. V'omer Keser, you say Keser. However, even though we're going to say Keser, it's not the Shabbos and Yom Tov version of Kedusha. It's not the extended version of Kedusha with Kevoidai Malay Olam, Misharsa Shayalim Zelazeh. No. You say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh Hashem Tzvakos, Malay Chala Aretz Kevoidai. You don't go to Kevoidai Malay Olam. Umasa Mishabchim V'Yomrim. And this is Sfard, you would go straight to Ulumasam Mishabchim V'Yomrim, Kemoi B'Kedusha Shachos. V'achar Shesiyam Chazaras HaTfilah, after the completion of Chazaras HaShatz, Omer Kaddish, you're going to say Kaddish Shalem, V'Omer Mizbar Barchi Nafshi Es Hashem, and you're going to insert Barchi Nafshi, says the Mishnah Berurah, beginning with Ois Katan Zayin. V'Omer Keser, Hainu L'fi Minig B'nei Sfarad. this would be Nusach Sfarad. V'ana b'nei Ashkenaz, Armim Nekadesh, Kamay B'Tfilah Shachris. Ois Kalaches, Armim Kaddish, Hainu Kaddish Shalem. After Chazar Sachatz of Musaf, you say Kaddish Shalem, Im Tiskabel B'Shvil HaTfilah, because that's the closure on the Shemona Esrei of Musaf. We recite Baruch Nafshi after the davening on Rosh Chodesh. Why? Because you have a pasuk in Baruch Nafshi, Yareach Asa L'Mayadim. The Rebbe Shalom created the moon, which charts out for us the calendar that the Yom Tovim are based on. Because of Magen Avram, the Magen Avram writes, the B'Ksas B'Kamais Ein Omer Moisai. In some places they did not say Baruch Nafshi. In some places they say Baruch Nafshi and they don't say the regular Yom. That's the Minhag HaGra. The reason for that is because the Gra said, why do we say the Yom every day? Because the capital of Tillim that we say for each day, that's the Shira that the Leviim sang in the Beis HaMikdash by the Karban Tamid. Says the Gra, on Rosh Chodesh, they said Baruch Nafshi. On Rosh Chodesh, the Shira of the Leviim was Baruch Nafshi. It wasn't the regular Shir Shel Yom. So we don't say the regular Shir Shel Yom. We only say Baruch Nafshi. That's the Minhag HaGra. Moving along to the final sif in this Siman, Sif Dalet says the Makaber. Nayhagim lachloitz tefillin kishareitzim l'hispal musaf. As we all know, we take off our tefillin on Rosh Chodesh before musaf. Says the Mishnah Berurah Nayhagim. Atam, the reason we take off the tefillin is the kamoy de'ein manichin tefillin b'yomtiv b'shum sheyomtiv ba'atzmai ois. We know that we don't put on tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Why is that? Because Shabbos, we don't tefillin are called an ois. Tefillin are called a sign. They're a sign, they're a symbol of the relationship that we have with the Rabbeinu Shalom. We put on tefillin as an ois, as a sign. Well, Shabbos is also an ois. Ois hi la'olam. It's an ois. Beini uvein b'nei Yisrael. Shabbos is an ois of our relationship. Yom Tov is also an ois. First of all, Yom Tov is an ois because the same way Shabbos is an ois, Yom Tov is also called Shabbosayin. So Yom Tov is also nice. Also, the psukim that describe the Karban Pesach and the Yom Tov of Pesach by Yitzias Mitzrayim also uses the word ois. And all the Yom Tovim are iskash lahadadi. All of the Yom Tovim are compared to each other. So Shabbos is an ois, Yom Tov is an ois, and therefore we don't put on tefillin, which is an ois. Why? To show that on Shabbos and Yom Tov we don't need an additional ois. If we would put on tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov, it would be denigrating to the ois of Shabbos and Yom Tov. So on Shabbos and Yom Tov, you don't put on tefillin, and on Rosh Chodesh, we also don't put on tefillin. K'moy Kain, says the Mishnah Berurah, yesh linig b'Rosh Chodesh on kol panim b'shas musaf shamaskiru musfei hayom. We're mamish announcing the Yom Tov aspect of Rosh Chodesh when we daven musaf. When do we have a musaf? We have a Musaf on Yom Tov. So when we daven Musaf on Rosh Chodesh, we're proclaiming the Yom Tov aspect on Rosh Chodesh. So it would be improper to wear tefillin. Shamaskir Musaf Yom Tov. It's a skir gamkein who kein ois. The cause of our people got it right. Yesh lachitz at tefillin be'uval l'siyayin kaidem yihiratzayin shenishbach ukecha. The Pri Megadim says that we should actually take off our tefillin in middle of uval l'siyayin before the hiratzayin near the end of uval l'siyayin. I think the point is that we should not take off the tefillin between the Chatzi Kaddish after Ashrei of Olotzion and the Shemona Esrei of Musaf, because we don't want to hefsik between the Kaddish and the Shemona Esrei. Kaddish has a dual function after Ashrei of Olotzion. It's a Kaddish that goes back on the Psukim of Ashrei of Olotzion. It's also a Kaddish that goes forward onto the Shemona Esrei, and therefore we want to be memayit the hefsik, according to the Pri Megadim. Some have the minig only to take the ritzuas of the shel yad off their fingers at that point. Miu calls it Rosh Chodesh. This is only again Rosh Chodesh. Ava b'chalamayit shu Yom Tov Gomor chalamayit, which is a real Yom Tov. We take off our tefillin earlier. Yesh lachaltzam kadam hal. Magen Avram says we take off our tefillin before hal. At least those of us who put on tefillin on chalamayit. Okay, thank you for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discussing limud HaTorah. Should be Megan against Krias. Roll the Marshal should said Yeshua's refuas shaduchim parnasa to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias God Tzedek b'mehera v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.